So, it's definitely been a little while since the last video, but I'm back now and super excited to start working on the game again. I titled this video Starting Over, but that isn't entirely true. It's more like I'm working on a new project entirely. If you were interested in that roguelike bullet hell game I was working on before, the project still exists, it's just in an indefinite hiatus for now while I work on this new project. You know, in classic game developer fashion, I just didn't feel motivated to work on that game, so I'm starting a new project instead. So I'll try my best to explain my idea for this new game. If I had to summarize what this game is, I would call it a turn-based, grid-based, roguelike-based game. And when I say turn-based, I don't mean like Hearthstone, I just mean that the player and enemies cannot move or attack at the same time. Closer to something like Crypt of the Necrodancer, but this won't have a music system in it. The player will spawn into a tile-based room along with some enemies. Both the player and the enemies are restricted to tile-based movement. Some tiles will apply status effects to the player if they are stepped on. For example, there could be a lava tile that would deal a small amount of fire damage. I'm planning on having a variety of enemy types with different attack and movement patterns, almost like chess pieces. Once all the enemies are dead, the player will gain a small power boost and then progress to the next room, which will be slightly harder than the previous room. I'll show you what I've worked on so far. I haven't gotten a chance to work on any of the visuals yet, so there isn't going to be anything fancy to look at, so just bear with me. Just to give you an idea of what I've worked on so far, let's run through the code for a little bit. I'm going to absolutely rip through this part because it's a lot to go through. I have this grid manager script here for generating the tiles for each room. We set up a tile dictionary here at the top and then loop through both the X and the Y axis for the grid. We set up a variable for randomizing the tiles, then we instantiate whatever that random tile was, and then finally add that tile to the dictionary. And the outcome of the grid generation method looks like this. Pretty much a checkerboard with some randomly placed water tiles. Now we need some tiles to instantiate. I have 4 tile scripts here that all derive from the base tile script. Let's take a look. The tile script contains a collection of methods to help move characters around the grid. The walkable bool checks if a tile should be walkable and if another unit is already occupying the tile. The set unit to tile method takes a unit, which could be a player or an enemy, and sets its position to the tile. It does this by assigning the unit to the tile and lerping the transform position with a coroutine. Okay, now that we have the tiles and the grid done, we need some way to instantiate our player and enemies when a grid is generated. So let's take a look at a unit manager. So, inside of our unit manager, here I have 2 methods. One for spawning a player and one for spawning enemies. The spawn player method instantiates a player variable and grabs the spawn tile. Then it calls the set unit to tile method we talked about in the tile script. Okay, let's take a look here. Our grid has generated, but it looks like the player is not here. The player game object has been added as a serialized field. Turns out the player was spawning before the grid generated, and because of this, the player couldn't find its assigned tile. So to fix this, I'm going to start working on the game manager, which was something I was going to work on anyways, I'm just doing it a little sooner than I thought I would. So, game manager script. Not much to talk about here. I have a switch statement containing a couple game states that I'm planning on having. Inside of the generate grid game state, I have the generate grid first, then spawning the player, then spawning the enemies. Okay, looks like our player is spawning now, but him sliding in like that doesn't look that great. I think this is because he's being instantiated at 0, and then lerping to the assigned tile. I can fix this by manually setting his position to the tile before the method is called. And there we go, he's spawning in the correct tile now. Okay, now that we have our player, we need a way to move him. I've already set up the set tile to unit method inside of the tile script, but we need to call it somewhere. So to do this, I'm going to set up a player controller script. Okay, so I have this movement bool function here. If the player left clicks, we assign this get raycast hit function to this tile variable selected tile. The raycast hit function returns a raycast hit based on the mouse position. So back in the selected tile variable, we are taking the collider's tile component of the raycast hit and assigning it to the variable. Then, in an if statement, we check to make sure that the tile is in our player's range, which may vary depending on how far the player has progressed in the game, and also if the tile is walkable or not. The isInRange function returns true if the distance is less than the range variable. From there, we run the setUnitToTile function from the selected tile. And as you can see, if we click on a tile that's one tile distance away from the player now moves to that tile. If I try to click on a tile 2 tiles away from the player or more, it doesn't move, which means everything is working properly. I lied. Everything is not working properly. We have a problem right now. As you can see in the log here, the player is currently on tile 70, but if we look in the inspector at tile 70, we can see here that the occupied unit is none, and that means that the player is not occupying this tile. If I move up one tile to tile 71, still not occupying any tile. It's not great, we're not occupying anything. Let's check another tile, 75. Oh! Player's occupying tile 75. Tile 74, occupying tile 74. 73, working. 72, working. 71, oh, 71, not working. If the tiles did not reliably know they were being occupied, I had a big problem. This means multiple units could occupy or spawn on a single tile, or when an enemy or player attacked, they would instead move to that tile. This was game breaking and I couldn't reliably debug this issue. After hours of debugging the issue without any success, I finally found something. Okay, so take a look at this. I was scrolling down the hierarchy, looking at I'm like, where are all these tiles going? And then I scroll farther down, and there's another set of tiles down here. So I realized that in my generate grid script, despite having the game manager, I still had the start method in here that I needed to delete. So I get rid of that. That should fix the problem. Boom! Okay, we're back in it, boys. Let's get some enemies spawning in here. Unit manager spawn enemies method. Set a for loop for a random amount of enemies to spawn and do the same stuff we did inside of the spawn player script. Now let's do something with these enemies. In the player controller, I created an interact with combat bool function and used a raycast hit to detect if we clicked on an enemy and then attack them. And as you can see, we got some enemies spawning in on random tiles. I can walk up to this enemy up here and click attack, and I attack. And yeah, that's all I've got so far. If you've made it this far in the video, consider subscribing to the channel. It would help the channel a ton, and you can follow the progress on the game more easily. Next, I'm planning on implementing the combat system and hopefully replacing the placeholder art. Thanks so much for watching, and hopefully I'll have some more to show soon.